The tall glass windows of the corporate headquarters gleamed in the morning sun as employees hurried through the lobby with files in hand and nervous looks on their faces. Everyone knew this was the day the CEO would test the prototype engine that had stalled the company for months. The arrogant CEO named Richard strutted into the engineering bay with a smug grin on his face, his tailored suit sharp, and his voice louder than it needed to be. Around him stood the best engineers in the company, each one exhausted from countless late nights trying and failing to bring the massive industrial engine to life. Richard paced back and forth, his eyes falling on a quiet woman standing at the back of the room. Her name was Emily. She was small in stature, dressed plainly, and hardly ever spoke during meetings, preferring to observe from the corner and scribble notes in her worn notebook. Richard smirked and raised his voice so everyone could hear. "So, Emily," he sneered, "care to tell us how you would fix this impossible machine since you seem so quiet back there?" The engineers chuckled nervously, hoping she would not embarrass herself. Emily looked up slowly, her calm eyes meeting his with no hint of fear. "I could try," she said softly, "but you might not like how quickly it will be done." Her words stirred murmurs across the room, some engineers stifling laughs, others exchanging doubtful looks. Richard clapped his hands dramatically. "Wonderful, let us all watch as our quiet little assistant pretends to be an engineer." The room erupted in uneasy laughter, but Emily did not flinch. She stepped forward, rolling up her sleeves, as if the mocking words never touched her. She approached the massive engine and placed her hand lightly on its frame. For a moment she simply listened to the hum of metal, the silence of circuits, the faint click of an unresponsive valve. The others grew restless, watching her stand there still, as if in some kind of trance. Richard scoffed. "Do you need me to bring you a manual, dear?" Emily ignored him. Her hands moved with surprising confidence as she opened a panel revealing a labyrinth of wires, gears, and pistons. She began to work with precision and speed, her fingers gliding over the components as though she had built the engine herself. The engineers leaned closer, whispering among themselves, astonished at the way she identified flaws no one else had noticed. Within minutes, she adjusted a critical valve, rewired a section that had been misaligned, and reassembled the pieces with flawless accuracy. Finally, she closed the panel and, without looking at anyone, pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life. The room fell silent as the deep, steady hum filled the bay, vibrating the floor under their feet. Richard stood frozen, his smug grin slipping from his face, replaced with shock and disbelief. Emily turned calmly and said, "I told you it would not take long." The engineers gasped, then broke into cheers, some clapping their hands, others shaking their heads in amazement. But Emily only stepped back, her quiet demeanor unchanged, as if fixing the impossible machine had been no more difficult than tying a shoelace. Richard struggled to speak, his pride wounded, his authority challenged in front of the entire team. He pointed at her with trembling fingers, his voice cracking. "Who are you really?" Emily simply gave a small smile and replied, "Just someone who understands engines in her sleep." The entire room erupted again, this time with laughter and awe directed at her, not at him. And for the first time, Richard realized he was no longer in control of the room. Richard clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself as the applause continued to echo around the engineering bay. He raised his hand to silence the crowd, but even then the excitement lingered, the engineers whispering about Emily as though they had just witnessed a miracle. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice, but keeping his words sharp. "That was luck, Emily, nothing more," he muttered. "Engines like this take years of mastery, not childish guesses." Emily met his glare calmly, her voice steady. "I do not rely on luck, Richard. The first rely on understanding what others overlook." Her words stung him, and he quickly turned to the crowd, desperate to reclaim his authority. "Do not be fooled," he barked. "One working prototype does not mean she knows everything." But before he could continue, the engine behind them shifted gears, purring smoothly, like a beast brought to life, its flawless operation speaking louder than any argument he could muster. One of the senior engineers stepped forward, his eyes wide with respect. "Emily, how did you know the wiring was off? We tested that system 100 times. Emily glanced at him and replied gently, "You tested it using the model in the manual. I tested it using my mind and my instinct, and machines always speak if you listen long enough." The room grew quiet once more, her words sinking into every corner of the bay. Richard's fists tightened at his sides, his confidence slipping further away with every admiring glance the team gave Emily. Desperation crept into his voice. Fine, then, if you truly understand engines, let us see how you handle something more advanced. He gestured to another project hidden beneath a heavy tarp in the corner of the room. The engineers exchanged nervous glances, whispers spreading among them that the machine under the tarp was a disaster project, one even Richard had declared unsalvageable. Emily walked toward it unhurried, her steps calm, her eyes fixed on the challenge ahead. Richard smirked once more, convinced she would finally stumble in front of them all. But as Emily pulled back the tarp, revealing the tangled mess of steel circuits and broken parts, her lips curved ever so slightly, as though she had just been handed a puzzle she had already solved in her dreams. The engineers leaned closer, the room thick with tension, waiting to see if the quiet woman would once again defy every expectation. Would you like me to continue into the moment where Emily begins dismantling Richard's impossible project piece by piece, stunning everyone even further? Emily crouched beside the broken machine, her hands brushing lightly across the cold metal as if she were greeting an old friend. The engineers gathered in a half-circle behind her, whispering among themselves, most of them certain that not even she could breathe life into the mess before her. Richard crossed his arms, smugness returning to his expression. He leaned back, as if waiting for her inevitable failure. Emily tilted her head, studying the warped gears and scorched wiring, her eyes narrowing in concentration. She tapped gently on the casing, listening to the hollow echoes, then nodded to herself, as though she had just confirmed a theory. She reached for a small toolkit left abandoned by another engineer months earlier, and without hesitation began removing bolts and screws, placing each piece carefully beside her. Her movements were swift yet precise, every twist of the wrist and every adjustment carried the ease of someone who lived and breathed machines. The room fell so quiet that even the faint clinking of metal sounded loud. One of the junior engineers finally whispered, "Is she mapping it all out in her head?" Another replied, "She has to be. No one else could take apart this disaster without diagrams or notes." Richard rolled his eyes, but even he could not hide the flicker of unease in his gaze. Emily paused halfway through the dismantling and pointed to a section of the frame. A stress crack had formed along a joint so subtle it could barely be seen unless one knew where to look. "This is where it failed," she said softly. "The imbalance spread from here and corrupted the rest of the system." The engineers gasped. They had examined that frame countless times, but none had spotted the flaw. She continued working, smoothing out wires, repairing joints, replacing burnt fuses, until slowly the shapeless wreck began to resemble the engine it was always meant to be. Hours passed, but Emily never slowed. Her hands moved, as if guided by memory rather than sight. Richard's smirk had completely vanished, his face pale, as he realized she was succeeding where his best teams had given up. Finally, Emily reassembled the last panel, tightened the final screw, and sat back, wiping her hands calmly on a cloth. Without a word, she pressed the ignition button. The machine hesitated for only a moment before roaring alive, its power surging through the bay like thunder, steady and flawless. The engineers erupted into cheers, louder than before, some jumping in disbelief, others crowding closer to study the engine running perfectly at full capacity. Richard stood frozen, his authority slipping through his fingers. With every second the machine continued to hum. Emily rose to her feet, quietly brushing dust from her hands, and looked at Richard, her expression calm and steady. "This machine did not fail because it was impossible," she said. "It failed because no one truly listened to it." The words struck like lightning, leaving Richard speechless as the room erupted again with admiration and respect for the quiet woman who had just done the impossible twice in a single day. Do you want me to continue into the next scene where Emily's genius begins spreading beyond the company and Richard scrambles to keep control of his position? The sound of the engine echoed through the walls long after the cheering settled. Emily stood calmly in the center of the room while the engineers buzzed around her, their voices full of awe and questions they had never thought they would ask someone like her. "How did you know the balance point? What trick did you use?
Can you teach us how to see it that way?"
Emily answered each softly with patience, but never once bragged, her tone steady, as though what she had done was the most natural thing in the world. Richard, on the other hand, remained at the edge of the crowd, his face stiff, his jaw locked, as he watched the respect in the room slip away from him and fall entirely into Emily's quiet presence. He tried to step forward, raising his voice above the noise. Enough, everyone back to work. This is only one success. We cannot afford to waste time. But no one rushed back. The engineers lingered around Emily, some taking notes, others simply watching her hands, as if every small movement carried some secret knowledge. Richard felt a pang of desperation, something he was not used to feeling in his empire of control. Emily finally turned to him, her eyes calm but unshaken. "Richard, you wanted results. I gave them to you. This company is not struggling because the machines are flawed. It is struggling because arrogance blinds it from seeing the truth." Her words hung in the air like a blade sharp enough to cut the tension. Several of the senior engineers shifted uncomfortably, but none dared to defend Richard this time. He forced a smile, though it barely reached his eyes. "Then perhaps you should show us more if you are so certain," he said, his voice tight. Emily did not flinch. She nodded. "If you want results, I will give them. But understand this, I am not here for your pride. I am here for the work." The engineers exchanged glances, whispers running like a current through the bay. One thing was becoming clear: Emily was not just an assistant, she was a leader in her own right. Richard felt the walls of power closing in around him, but he refused to show weakness. He straightened his suit and said, "Fine, then we shall see just how far your so-called genius goes." Emily gave the faintest of smiles and returned her gaze to the machine, her fingers brushing across the surface, as though she already knew there was more to uncover, more to prove, and more to build. The atmosphere shifted. The room no longer belonged to Richard. His presence felt smaller, while Emily's quiet strength filled every corner. And though he tried to convince himself otherwise, Richard knew he was no longer in control of his own company. Do you want me to continue into the moment where Emily's reputation begins spreading outside the company and others start noticing her brilliance while Richard grows increasingly desperate? Word about Emily's work began to slip beyond the walls of the company. At first, it was a whisper from one engineer to a colleague at another firm, then a quiet mention in a technical forum. Soon enough, other industries began asking questions about the mysterious woman who fixed an engine that even top engineers had declared impossible. Journalists started making calls, trade magazines sent requests for interviews, and slowly Emily's name began to surface, attached to a quiet but undeniable brilliance. Inside the company, Richard grew restless each day. He felt the shift as clients began addressing Emily directly in meetings, seeking her opinion more than his. She never asked for attention, yet it followed her like a shadow, and no matter how hard Richard tried to position himself at the center, the spotlight refused to move from her. One morning, as Emily walked into the office, a crowd of younger engineers stood waiting. They had notebooks, sketches, and designs in hand. They surrounded her, asking for advice on projects, asking her to teach them how she saw problems the way she did. Emily smiled softly. She took the time to explain to each one, but she also reminded them to think, not just copy her answers. Her patience made them respect her even more. Richard watched from his glass office above, his fingers tapping sharply against the desk. Every laugh and cheer from the floor below made his chest feel tighter. He called for Emily to join him, and when she stepped into his office, he forced a smile again. "Emily," he said carefully, "I think it would be best for the company if you allowed me to be the public face of our breakthroughs. Your work will be recognized, but through the proper channels." Emily stood still, her eyes steady on him. "Richard, if you want me to hide in the background so you can take credit, then you should say it plainly." Richard froze, caught off guard by her calm bluntness. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not without fear. Emily continued, "I am here to build, not to polish egos. If the company wants results, then it must be honest about who provides them." For a moment, silence stretched heavy in the office. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Emily gave a respectful nod, turned, and walked back to the floor where the engineers waited, eager to learn from her. The contrast was clear. Outside Richard's office, there was energy, movement, and growth. Inside his office, there was only bitterness. And as the days passed, it became harder for him to ignore that Emily was no longer just an assistant. She was becoming the true heart of the company. Do you want me to continue into the part where Richard tries to undermine Emily by setting up a public challenge, thinking she will fail in front of an audience? Richard could not let it go. His pride was a chain around his neck, and every cheer for Emily pulled it tighter. He stayed late in his office one night staring at a blank page on his desk. Then finally, he began scribbling an idea. If Emily was so brilliant, he would put her under pressure in a place where failure would be seen by everyone, not just the company, but investors, clients, and reporters. The next morning, he announced a grand demonstration, a showcase of innovation. He framed it as a celebration of the company's future, but in his mind it was a trap. He called it the impossible challenge, a task to assemble, design, and run a prototype engine live in front of an audience within a strict time limit. The engineers murmured nervously, but Richard kept his voice confident. He promised this would prove the company's leadership in technology. When Emily heard the announcement, she simply listened without expression. She could see the weight of Richard's scheme written all over his face, but she did not protest. Instead, she nodded and said, "If it will help the company, then I will do it." The day of the event arrived. The stage was set with bright lights, rows of seats filled with business leaders and journalists, cameras flashing everywhere. At the center of the stage stood a disassembled engine, its parts scattered across tables, wires, tubes, and panels carefully placed to look impossible to sort. Richard took the microphone, his smile wide as he introduced Emily. He praised her in words, but the sharpness in his tone revealed the edge of his envy. Emily walked calmly onto the stage, her hands steady, her gaze moving over the crowd, then to the engine. She touched the parts gently, as if greeting old friends. The audience whispered, doubting she could do it in time. Some laughed quietly, just as Richard hoped. But Emily began to move. Her hands worked quickly, not in frantic bursts, but with a rhythm that felt almost like music. She fit pieces together, as though the engine were guiding her rather than the other way around. Minutes passed, and what had looked like chaos began to form into structure. The scattered parts aligned into a shape, the engine slowly taking life. The whispers in the audience shifted, amazement replaced doubt. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, unable to look away. Richard sat stiff in his chair, his smile fading as each click and turn of Emily's hands brought the engine closer to completion. At one point, a bolt rolled off the table. Richard smirked, thinking she had slipped, but Emily caught it with ease, slid it into place, without even looking. The silence in the hall deepened as the final connections sparked to life. Emily wiped her hands, then pressed the ignition switch. The engine roared, awake, strong, steady, and flawless. The sound filled the room like thunder, shaking the air with power. The crowd erupted into applause, shouts of astonishment, reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing brighter than ever. Emily stepped back, her face calm as always, but her eyes glimmered with quiet fire. She had not only completed the challenge, she had transformed Richard's trap into her triumph. Richard could barely breathe. His plan had crumbled before his eyes, and instead of humiliation, Emily now stood higher than ever, her brilliance undeniable in the eyes of all who watched. Do you want me to continue with the aftermath, showing how the audience turns toward Emily as the true leader while Richard begins plotting in desperation behind the scenes? The applause lasted so long Richard felt it rattling in his chest like a drumbeat that would not stop. Investors pushed forward to shake Emily's hand, journalists crowded her with questions, and engineers from the company stood tall with pride, as if her victory belonged to them too. Richard tried to force a smile back onto his face. He even stepped onto the stage to take the microphone, but the cheers for Emily drowned out his voice. He looked at her standing with such calm strength, and his pride twisted into something darker. He had built this company, yet in a single afternoon Emily had become its brightest star. After the event, Emily returned quietly to her workshop while Richard remained in the spotlight, answering questions, though everyone knew who had truly earned the admiration. That night, Richard paced his office, the city lights glowing through the tall windows, his fists clenched as he muttered to himself. "She makes it look easy," he said. "She cannot keep outshining me." He pored over company records, trying to find a weakness, something to prove she was not perfect, but every file only deepened his frustration. Her designs were flawless, her solutions ahead of their time. Meanwhile, Emily sat in her small apartment surrounded by old tools and notebooks. Her mind was already moving to the next idea, sketching out engines that had not yet been imagined. She thought little of the applause. She only cared about the work and the problems waiting to be solved. But in the boardrooms and hallways of the company, her name spread like fire. Employees spoke of her brilliance, investors demanded more demonstrations, and even rival firms began sending inquiries, curious about the quiet woman who built engines, as if in her sleep. Richard watched all of this with growing unease. He knew that soon he would have to act not just with words or petty traps, but with a plan that would either break her or prove once and for all that he was still in control. And so, he began to prepare another stage, one far more dangerous than the last. Do you want me to continue with Richard setting up a bigger scheme that risks not just Emily's reputation, but the entire company's future? Richard called an emergency board meeting under the pretense of discussing a new expansion plan, but his true motive was hidden behind his sharp smile. He stood at the head of the long table, his voice steady as he spoke of competition overseas, of investors demanding a bold vision, of the need for one daring project to prove their dominance. The board leaned in, curious and cautious, as Richard laid out his plan, a prototype engine unlike anything seen before, an engine that could power massive aircraft with unmatched efficiency, but it required risky, untested components. Some of the members shifted nervously in their seats, warning about the costs and dangers, but Richard waved their concerns away, insisting this was their moment to make history. Then he said her name. Emily will lead it, he declared. She is the only one capable of such precision. The board murmured in agreement. Their faith in Emily was unshakable. They had seen her brilliance firsthand. Richard knew this and used it against her. That night, Richard visited the restricted lab where old blueprints and failed experiments were stored. He dug through crates until he found what he wanted, a discarded design for a component that had once caused catastrophic failure. He tucked it under his arm, a glint of calculation in his eyes. Meanwhile, Emily worked late at her station, unaware of the storm forming around her. She traced lines across paper, her mind already aligning gears and pistons, imagining how to push the limits of physics itself. She felt the weight of the assignment, but instead of fear, she felt a strange calm. The challenge lit a fire within her. She knew the project could change the future if done right. The next morning, Richard approached her in the workshop, his voice smooth. "The board is counting on you, Emily," he said with an air of mock encouragement. "This is your chance to prove yourself once again." Emily simply nodded, her focus unshaken. "I will make it work," she replied. But Richard's smirk lingered as he walked away, already picturing the chaos if she unknowingly used the flawed design he had planted. He believed this time her genius would falter, and when it did, he would be there to reclaim the spotlight. Yet what Richard did not understand was that Emily never trusted blueprints left behind by others. She always rebuilt from the ground up, questioning every line, every bolt, every assumption. And in that meticulous process, she would soon stumble across the hidden flaw, one that would reveal not just danger, but the intent of someone who wished her to fail. Do you want me to continue with Emily beginning to uncover Richard's sabotage while the pressure of the board and investors grows heavier around her? Emily laid the old blueprint flat under the bright lamp, her eyes scanning the strange alignment of valves and chambers. Something about it felt forced, unnatural, as though whoever designed it wanted it to collapse under pressure. She frowned and pulled out her own calculations side by side. The differences were glaring to her trained eye. The angles were off by just enough to cause heat to build until the engine tore itself apart. Emily leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the desk slowly. She whispered to herself, this was not an accident, this was deliberate. The next morning, she walked into the workshop and found Richard already there, pretending to inspect the tools, his suit too sharp for the grease and dust of the lab. "Good morning, Emily," he said with his usual smirk. "I trust the design is clear enough for you." "It is, after all, quite straightforward, if you are as skilled as everyone believes." Emily did not answer his bait. Instead, she calmly folded the old blueprint and tucked it into her folder, her eyes steady on him, as if she could see through the layers of charm and arrogance. Richard chuckled, mistaking her silence for hesitation. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Do not let the board down, Emily. History will remember this project." When he walked out, Emily finally exhaled and turned to her workbench. She had made her decision. She would build the engine not as the blueprint demanded, but as her instincts commanded. Days turned into nights, and the hum of machines filled the workshop. Emily never stopped, her hands covered in grease, her notebook filling with formulas, every detail carefully reworked. Engineers who passed by whispered in awe at her relentless pace. Even the most complex problems seemed to bend under her focus. She was not building an engine, she was sculpting a future. And in her heart, Emily knew the day of unveiling would be more than a test of machinery. It would be the moment the truth about Richard would come to light, whether he was ready for it or not. At last the day of unveiling arrived. The board members, investors, and reporters gathered in the massive testing hall, the unfinished whispers echoing through the metal rafters, everyone's eyes fixed on the gleaming machine at the center. Richard stood at the podium, adjusting his tie, his voice smooth as he addressed the crowd. Today you witnessed the birth of innovation. He gestured toward Emily. This young engineer has worked tirelessly under my direction, and now the future roars to life. Emily stepped forward, wiping her hands on a rag, her face calm, her voice steady as she corrected him. I did not follow his direction. I followed the truth of the design. The blueprint you all approved was flawed, deliberately flawed. She looked at Richard, and his smirk faltered. Gasps spread through the audience. Emily continued, I rebuilt this engine from the ground up, every bolt, every gear reimagined. If you had trusted his version, it would have failed catastrophically, risking lives and millions of dollars. Silence fell heavy until the chairwoman of the board spoke. Is this true, Richard? Her eyes sharp on him. Richard stammered, his confidence cracking under the weight of the revelation, his words tangling in excuses. The crowd no longer saw a visionary, they saw a fraud. The chairwoman turned to Emily, her voice firm. We will investigate, but today the work speaks for itself. Run the engine. Emily nodded and pressed the ignition switch. The hall filled with a deep, steady roar, the engine running smooth and flawless, the sound of triumph echoing louder than any applause. The crowd erupted. Investors stood, reporters scribbled furiously, and the board members exchanged approving nods, but Emily simply watched the machine, a quiet smile on her lips. Richard stood frozen, his empire crumbling, while Emily stood bathed in the glow of the machine. She had built her genius, undeniable, her legacy secured. And for the first time in her life, Emily did not feel like the quiet, underestimated woman in the corner. She felt like the architect of her own future.